With Mendelian genetics, we have predicted ratios, but many things do not follow along those patterns. We can have linked genes, sex-linked traits, multiple genes or polygenic traits, and non-nuclear inheritance. Going back to Mendelian, when we think Mendelian, it's a very simplified way of looking at genetic inheritance. The traits are determined by one gene. There are two alleles, and there is one dominant and one recessive allele. Again, this is hitting on non-Mendelian traits, so different examples from here on out are other ways that we don't have this simple one gene, two allele dominant recessive situation. So we can have codominance, and blood type is a good example of that. Again, it's not just one gene, two alleles. If we have AB blood, it's not that A is dominant or B is dominant. They are codominant because both the A and the B allele show up as surface antigens on AB blood. We can also look at incomplete dominance, where, again, it's not red or white. We can end up with this incomplete dominance when it is heterozygous. So if we have these heterozygous pink, we can come back. If it were homozygous dominant, we get red. Homozygous recessive is white, but heterozygous is almost like a blending or incomplete dominance. It's not one or the other. Other examples of non-Mendelian inheritance include polygenics, traits that are not just influenced by one gene. So again, you could still have this P generation where you have all recessive and all dominant and get an F1 generation that, again, you would have a combination of dominant and recessive, but because there's so many genes that are tying into this, it's, again, not just one or the other. You kind of get this mix. And in the F2 generation, it almost creates like a gradient where it's not just a couple alleles. You have lots of different variation within this. And again, it would be rare as you continue to move on to be completely dominant or completely recessive. And again, we kind of have this bell-shaped curve towards a mid-range of trait. Skin color would be an example of that. Skin color, it's not just one gene that determines your skin tone. You can have all sorts of variety based off of polygenic traits, many genes determining what is actually seen. So another example of non-Mendelian inheritance would be sex-linked inheritance. Again, when we're looking at Mendelian genetics and we're talking about pedigrees, we're talking about autosomal pedigrees, traits that are determined by genes on the autosomes and not the sex chromosomes. When we're talking about sex-linked inheritance, we're talking about genes that exist on the sex chromosomes. So one way to look at that is with fruit flies. So whether they have red eyes or white eyes is determined by a gene that exists on the X chromosome. So in this P generation, these male flies have the recessive white eye color. In this P generation, this female is homozygous for red eyes. They are going to pass on their gametes, and again, the female can only pass on an X, and both of the X's contain the dominant red eye allele. In this one, again, dad could pass on an X, creating a female offspring, or could pass on the Y, but the eye color is only tied to the X. So as we get our F1 generation, we are going to only, the male here is going to be red eye because, again, this white eye allele gets carried into the female fly, and it is not shown because of the red dominance. As we get into that F2 generation, we can get back to white-eyed fruit flies because mom carried the little R and she could pass it on to her son. who only gets the Y from dad. Another classic example of this is with red-green color blindness. So as we start looking at the structure of your retina, the light comes through, it interacts with rods and cones, and that allows us to see color. And there's this specific protein that interacts with the light and then sends a cellular signal that you are viewing red or green. And that particular protein comes from a gene located on the X chromosome. There's different versions of color blindness, but this is the one we are talking about in this example. It's on the X. So if you are X with the dominant allele, your protein works and it sends the signal. So a heterozygous woman would have normal vision, but she would be a carrier for color blindness. If you have the recessive colorblind allele, this protein, when it interacts with the light, does not change shape, and no cellular signal is sent to the brain to perceive the different colors. The only way you could be colorblind, again, males only need that one X unfunctioning protein. In order for a female to be colorblind, she has to have both X's have the recessive allele. So when we look at some Punnett square examples, if mom were a carrier and dad had normal vision, she could produce a son that's colorblind, but her daughter would have normal vision. Now, if we have a son, a man that's colorblind, and the mom has normal vision and is not a carrier, we would expect the daughters to be carriers, but they would still have normal vision, and the sons, if mom has normal vision and is not a carrier, all the sons are going to be normal. So how do females get colorblind? They have to have, dad has to be colorblind, and mom has to at least be a carrier. So if mom's a carrier and dad's colorblind, you can end up with a colorblind female. Now, the thing about this, if mom is colorblind, it is 100% guarantee that her sons will be colorblind. So as we look at this, now that ties into some of the trends we see in pedigrees. So in this situation, when we look at X-linked recessive disorders, and you look at it in general, there are going to be a lot more men than women that have the trait. And if you ever see a woman with the trait, their sons have to have the trait. So again, we can look at hemophilia, which is an X-linked recessive disorder in the royal family. Now, if you just look at this in general, you'll see that it's only males in this particular pedigree that have the trait. So again, that should be a tip-off that it's a possibly X-linked recessive trait. Again, in this one, it actually shows females half-shaded as carriers, and you can see that it is mom being a carrier that is able to pass on that carrier trait to daughters and give the trait to her sons. So, final example of non-Mendelian inheritance would be non-nuclear inheritance. Everything that we've been talking about so far has to do with genes and chromosomes and everything like that. But as we look at sexual reproduction, some traits, especially through mitochondria and chloroplasts, get passed not through the nucleus, but through the organelles. And when we look at fertilization, it's important to understand that the only thing the sperm contributes is the nucleus, is nuclear material. It's only the chromosomes from dad that get passed on to the child. So mom is contributing the entire rest of the cell, as well as fusing into the zygote nucleus. So again, dad contributes half of the nucleus, but mom is going to contribute everything else, especially mitochondria, And there's dozens of different mitochondrial diseases that exist as well. So it is from this initial zygote that we develop every single trillion other cell of a human. So it's all of the other things in here that get passed on through the cytosol and cytoplasm that come from mom. And so maternal inheritance is a lot of times tied into non-nuclear inheritance. So the same thing exists within plants. The pollen is the male, and it's the sperm that comes from the pollen that gets given to the egg in reproduction of plants. So again, it's the maternal or female side that contributes all of the other non-nuclear traits that are determined not through the chromosomes in the nucleus, but through other organelles. So again, many traits are non-Mendelian. We can look at linked traits, sex-linked traits, polygenic traits, and non-nuclear inheritance.